So last video, we talked about the anterior pelvic tilt and all the other compensations that come along with it. And I got so many messages saying that it perfectly described your issue. Now, I'm going to oversimplify some things, but I'm going to give you guys a few keys for that anterior pelvic tilt. Now, step one, remember your hamstrings are already over lengthened. They feel tight not because they're short, because they're long. I had one person message me about the 90-90 roller drill that we did, and he said, I guarantee doing an eccentric Nordic curl is going to be way better than doing a 90-90 hip lift and squeezing a foam roller. But he's missing one problem. Look, when I'm going down, this is an eccentrically oriented exercise. When I'm going down, what am I doing? I'm actually creating length. With an eccentric overload exercise, we're creating more length. And so when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so when you think of everything in terms of eccentric lengthening or stretching, that's us assuming that we're tight because we're short. That's not the case, especially in the case of this anterior pelvic tilt. We're over lengthened. Remember the band example where we were here and then we got into this anterior pelvic tilt and my hamstrings became tight because they're lengthened, not because they're shortened, because they're lengthened. And so doing something like an eccentric is probably only going to make it worse. Stretching is probably only going to make it worse. We want to concentrically orientate those hamstrings. And so we gave you the 90-90 drill. This one would be a progression to it where I could go single leg. So I'm 90 here, 90 here, 90 at the ankles. And I can first push my back into the ground. So I'm here, I'm smushing that bug with my back, and then I'm thinking about tilting that pelvis back. So if I had a tail, I'd be tucking that tail, all right? And then I'm just barely bringing my hips off. I'm not coming into a full hip bridge. And then from there, I can pull down on the box. So I'm engaging this left hamstring, and then I can extend, and I can just hang out in this position. I can reach in this position, and I can do my 5 breaths in through the nose, out through the mouth. You got to get all that air out, and when you do, you feel the transverse abdominis, the internal obliques. We could even hold that roller here and still get that adductor going. Now, it's not that this is purely a strength drill. Are we strengthening the correct muscles? Yes, but we're re-educating all of these muscles to work together to set the pelvis in a good position. We have to get away from thinking of muscles. We have to get away from thinking of strengthen this and stretch this. An anterior pelvic tilt is a movement, and just like any movement, if I was going to teach you how to shoot a 3-pointer, I wouldn't say, well, we got to strengthen the triceps and we got to stretch the biceps. No, we're going to go through the motion and the nervous system is going to adjust. And so in doing something like this, it's not that we're doing like this sympathetically driven exercise that's going to like transform your hamstring strength. It's more of a low-level exercise that you do throughout the day, and it re-educates. It gets your nervous system to fire the correct muscles, the hamstrings to get that posterior tilt, along with the adductors, along with the internal obliques and the transverse abdominis. And all these muscles have to work together to set that position. And so throughout the day, I'm putting myself into different exercises like this, and then I can make it a little bit more dynamic and tap the foot and come off. And of course, I'm pulling down on the box the whole time to really engage the hamstring, and I should feel like I'm in that posterior pelvic tilt, or relatively posterior compared to what I'm stuck in all day with my anterior tilt. Now, another good one could be here. I'm about 90 degrees, and then I'm thinking about pulling my heels back towards my butt. And so that's how I engage my hamstrings, is I'm dragging my heels back. My heels aren't actually moving, but I'm thinking about dragging them back. And then again, I'm pushing my lower back into the floor. And then I'm just going to reach at this 45-degree angle. And then I'm in through the nose. Expand those ribs. It's 360 expansion. Make sure that we're getting air in to the belly button and even below the belly button. So I'm in, and then I'm out. And when I come out, the ribs come down and in. A huge problem with this anterior pelvic tilt is we get this rib cage flare, and we get this back extension. And a lot of people think like, oh, my back hurts, I got to do a bunch of back extension exercises. That just makes it worse. That's just increasing that extension tone. We actually want the opposite. I want to get my rib cages down. So if I can actually get a little bit of rounding in that, you're actually going to feel a little bit better, and you're going to be able to turn off the erectors that are on all day. Because look, if I'm anteriorly tilted, my weight's moving forward. In order to not fall forward, I have to extend back. And so I have so much extension tone. So we want to get away from that. So exercises like this, when I'm breathing out, I'm thinking about bringing those ribs down. The opposite of a rib cage flare. Now another one, and I know a lot of you guys in that anterior orientation, your hip flexors feel tight. Again, you don't just attack the hip flexors with stretching. That's not the problem. The hip flexors are only a byproduct. It's only a scratch in your arm. Remember, you're allergic to something. We got to find out what you're allergic to. Don't just itch the arm. That's what the hip flexors are. We have to shorten the hamstring. We have to lengthen the hip flexors, but we're not lengthening them by stretching them. We're lengthening them by getting back into a good position. And from there, the hip flexors will take care of themselves. And so the hip flexors are affected by the diaphragm. The diaphragm is affected by the hip flexors. Remember, we're here. We're in this position. And so the diaphragm is running at a diagonal angle. So it's really messing up the entire biomechanics of the diaphragm. So a lot of times, every time you inhale, and this is 23,000 times a day, if you're inhaling and exhaling 23,000 times per day with poor biomechanics, a lot of times you're going to figure out how to get air in. And so you're going to assist with the back muscles. You're going to assist with the abs. You're going to assist with the scalenes in the neck. And so you're going to have a lot of muscles that shouldn't be respiration muscles all of a sudden helping in that respiration process, and then they get all tight and our posture gets all jacked up. So instead of being here, we want to do the opposite, and we want to be here. And I can just breathe in this position. So I'm pushing through my hands to almost round my back as much as I can, and I'm pushing it towards the sky. And then I'm just breathing in through the nose, and then I'm breathing out through the mouth. But when I breathe out through the mouth, I'm still holding that rounded mid-back. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about today is we got to make sure that we're removing the things that are going against our goal. So what is counterproductive? Well, if my problem is an anterior pelvic tilt, if I'm doing a bunch of hip hinge variations, RDLs, and that kind of stuff, that might put me right back in that pattern. And if I'm doing a bunch of RDLs, I might be eccentrically working those hamstrings a little bit too much anyways. Squat variations, you know, when we're getting that hip hinge, we're in that big anterior tilt. Most importantly, we have to fight to stay in extension. If you're into PRI, you've probably heard of the PEC, and that's the guys that walk around like this. That's the strength and conditioning syndrome, the proud chest, the flared rib cage, the extension tone. And then they get in the squat rack and they do more of it. They stay in that extension, and so that's going against our goal. We would want to remove our heavy squats. We would want to remove our hip hinge variations while we're taking care of this anterior tilt. And then once we take care of it, then we can move that to more of our warm-up drills and more of our correctives, and then we can slowly build back in our squats and our hip hinge variations. Now, in the meantime, to maintain strength, you could do stuff like a front foot elevated. So like if I came and I just put my front foot on a small box and I did my squats in that position, that's going to be a little bit better. That's going to work on early stage of gait compared to late stance gait. And so that's going to be a way better option if I just get into this split stance and I'm working from here. That's not going to work against our goal, and that can allow us to maintain strength in the lower body. Another drill that we can do, and we use this in all of our programs, is a basic hip bridge. So I can either just do a bilateral hip bridge, I can do a unilateral hip bridge, I can come into flexion, and now I really have to work on getting into extension. And I'm actually stretching out this hip flexor quite a bit. And so by training hip extension, we're gonna start to quiet down those hip flexors without necessarily having to stretch. Now, I'm not necessarily against hip flexor stretches, and sometimes it makes people feel better temporarily. Sometimes we can put it in a warm-up so that we feel loose, and then we can train in lower positions during that session. But for the most part, if you are in this anterior tilt, we don't really wanna think about stretching. We wanna think about how can we strength train and how can we re-educate our muscles so that we can get into a better position. And then the resting tension of those muscles takes care of itself and you move better. And all of a sudden you can go down and touch your toes. And all of a sudden we get back our hip flexor flexibility and we can get back into our wall side stretches and all that kind of good stuff. But until then, let's focus on regaining position of the pelvis and you're gonna feel a lot better.